Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Judgment Day. And I gotta say, man, this story just gets better and better. And this issue, God, it is so phenomenal. It's absolutely amazing. I'm trying to figure out if we should do this like just over the course of the week and then like every other day, just do like a second video. Or if we do this as like a weekly thing, right? Because the weekly thing just, it makes it so exciting, just kind of anticipate it. But I had to cover this story, right? So here's the thing. This story focuses on Exodus. And those of you guys who have been following the X-Men mythos as we've done it so far, right? Jonathan Hickman's run, going into Jerry Dugan's run and all that kind of stuff. You've seen Exodus just kind of lingering around, but you've never really seen him fight. And in fact, you never really got a whole lot of insight in the mind of Exodus, which kind of sucks because Exodus has been around for a long, long time, right? So Exodus, he originally appeared way back in 1993 with X Factor issue number 92. And in fact, he became a part of Magneto's acolytes when he was quote unquote woken up by Magneto in X-Force issue number 25, which I'm pretty sure was released that same year. But what's really funny about his character though, is that despite being introduced in the early 90s, we didn't get an origin for him until Black Knight, the one-shot story that was told in 1996 that it picked up off of a Defenders story, which basically saw that Dane Whitman, the Black Knight, and Cersei of the Eternals were basically time displaced and they ended up in the 12th century. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But what this initially does is it basically picks up on kind of the origin of Exodus, of Bennett Duperry. Now, this is a smart decision to make by Kieron Gillen. It's a genius decision because Exodus is a character people are now aware of, but only because of his time on the Quiet Council and everything going on with Jonathan Hickman's run up until now. But he's a character people don't know the story of. And a lot of people don't know just how ridiculously overpowered this guy is. It's crazy how powerful he is. So the thing about this is that Bennett Duperry initially rose to prominence during the Crusade. This initially opens up when he's actually out in the desert and he encounters the Phoenix Force. Now it doesn't possess him, but he simply just meets him. And it's one of those things where it was the first time that he actually encountered anything that could really be referred to as a god, despite the fact that he was fighting in the Crusades. Up until that point, it was just some disembodied being that exists out there in the ether, right? Whose word he follows. And like, that was it. That was really all there was. But seeing the Phoenix Force physically manifest actually instilled in him a faith, but it was actually a faith predicated on mutants. Now, the thing about this is he didn't know he was a mutant at the time. And we'll talk about how we reconcile that here in a second. But what it does here is it jumps back to Krakoa and it basically picks up with everything that he's talking about and really just the Quiet Council themselves, who were talking about how a war with the Eternals are coming, right? So this takes place slightly before the events of Judgment Day #1 proper. But it's one of those things where they're kind of like, you know, how do we come to terms with this, right? One, Nathaniel Essex, right? Like Mr. Sinister, he's been kidnapped and we don't know exactly how to cope with this. Like if he's been taken by the Eternals, they've literally started a conflict by basically kidnapping one of our own. How do we respond in kind without instigating a full-scale war? Now, on one side, you have what are basically the more level-headed people, right? So Emma Frost to a degree, Charles Xavier, so on and so forth. On the other side, you have the Warhawks like Sebastian Shaw, who were like, no, we can't operate on the defense. It's offense. We have to go and get him. And then if a war starts, whatever, let the chips fall where they may, right? We are the mutant population. There are more of us than there are those Eternals. We can take them on. But the reality here is that Sebastian Shaw painfully misunderstands just how many Eternals there are and what form those Eternals take. And that's one of the things that's really being hit on here during the Judgment Day story, is that the Eternals are not simply just the people that we've seen Marvel publish stories about over the course of the last however many decades, and like that's it. That the Eternals are huge in number and there's a variety of them all over the world that we simply just didn't know about, which is kind of interesting because in a lot of ways the Judgment Day event and the whole revelation of the Eternals in Marvel Comics is very much following the Inhumanity storyline. And I'm sure a lot of you guys who are aware of Inhumanity coming out of the storyline that came out of like Infinity, right? That story itself, which basically dealt with Black Bolt detonating the Terrigen bomb, spreading the Terrigen mist across the world, and then all these people who were Inhumans and didn't know it suddenly just waking up to become Inhumans, right? right? Just going through Terrigenesis, so like, you know, Kamala Khan and like all those different characters. It very much feels that way to a degree, except it's really more that we're discovering the fact that they've always been here, as opposed to the fact that like they're just now coming into existence. But one of the things that happens here, and Xavier is really kind of the top guy in the Quiet Council, albeit unofficially, they are all technically equal in power, but because of Xavier's history with the X-Men, he's kind of like the number one guy. Sort of everybody just kind of silently agrees on that he really looks at it from the perspective of saying, okay, like the reality here is that the Eternals, they hold no grudge that we know of. We expected Orcus, we are not prepared for war against them. But from Exodus's perspective, he's just kind of hitting on this and he's like, Sinister's gone. This is suspicious for dozens of reasons. We should purge him from the Quiet Council. And it's one of those things where as he thinks and as he analyzes, he looks over at Destiny and he sees that Destiny has a kind of small twitch in her chair, which is enough for him to realize him just having these thoughts could potentially have a massive impact on the future. Now remember, it's very difficult for Destiny to predict what's going to happen based on what somebody's thinking or things that are supposed to happen in the far-flung future. She's very, very good at predicting on the battlefield. It's one of the reasons why when she was part of Mystique's Brotherhood, she was instrumental in their ability to defeat the X-Men, because literally they would be in the heat of combat and she would be like, Gambit's coming from that direction, and like they would be able to overpower Gambit before he even got there. It was just one of those things, right? I might go back and cover those older X-Men stories because there's just so many callbacks in this run and it makes me really nostalgic for it. But what he ends up doing is actually talking about how Destiny currently sits in the chair of Apocalypse and Apocalypse is gone. And then he has a flashback to his own history and says Apocalypse is here, but here is not now. And it's one of those things where he's literally jumping to his own origin story. Now, this is one of the things to explain here, right? Because what you end up having is this situation where you basically end up having Cersei and Eobard Garrington, who essentially meet with Exodus after he becomes Exodus. So to fill in these gaps here, which are not readily explained by Kieron Gillen, and to actually give you the origin of Exodus, the way this played out is that as part of the Crusades, that Exodus and, or I guess Bennett Duperry, which is what he's initially known as, and Eobard Garrington are basically trying to find what's called the Tower of Power. Now, the Tower of Power itself, at least as it was explained in the old Black Knight Exodus story, it's not really a tower of power in a literal sense. It's the home of the eternal pharaoh. Now, what they don't know is that it's actually the home of Apocalypse. They really don't know what they're getting into here. But the way this story played out is that it was actually picking up off the heels of an existing Defender story where the Black Knight Dane Whitman and Cersei were effectively time displaced. And so what it did is it led to them arriving in the 12th century. When that happened, the mind or spirit or whatever you want to call it of Dane Whitman entered the body of Eobard Garrington, who is basically his ancestor, right? He's one of the older Black Knights that existed in Marvel Comics before Dane Whitman became the Black Knight. And so what that did is it led to Dane just kind of occupying the body, but not actually having control, that Eobard himself had control. And so that's why if you go back and you read that story, that something seems a little off about Eobard Garrington when things first pick up, and he talks about how like he had seen a woman and like the whole thing feels like a dream to him, but he eventually encounters Cersei, and when that happens, he abandons the quest with Bennett Duperry, who continues on his own. And so ultimately he ends up coming across Apocalypse, and Apocalypse puts him through these kind of trials, which even now are not readily explained in this particular comic, at least even in just this one, the Immortal X-Men tie-in for Judgment Day. But the important thing here is the trials were done in the manner by which Apocalypse normally conducts trials, which is to say it was testing the mind, body, and spirit of Exodus to determine whether or not he was even worthy of any enhancements Apocalypse could give him. Ultimately, Bennett was proved worthy, and in doing so, Apocalypse realized that Bennett Duperry was a mutant. He activated his X gene and then amplified his powers. And what it did is it pushed Exodus to becoming an Omega level telepath and telekinetic. The guy's wildly powerful. I mean, this guy has an advanced, like an accelerated healing factor. It's not really on the same level as Wolverine, but it's an exceedingly capable healing factor. The guy's got enhanced longevity. His telekinesis is so fine-tuned that he can actually alter the molecular structure of matter. Now, Marvel's never moved that past just surface use, right? They've never moved it into the realm of him being able to like alter matter on a universal scale. Arguably he could. Marvel just doesn't really do it. So think of it more as like a soft cap on his powers. They just haven't really explored that part of his character yet. But even beyond that, the guy's telepathy is on the same level as as Jean Grey, Professor Xavier, those guys, he can teleport to virtually any distance, anywhere. It doesn't really matter where it is. The guy's ridiculously capable, but having those powers augmented and having his abilities amplified also added a caveat. And the reason why is because in this story, and this one that we're covering here, as well as in the old Black Knight Exodus stories, that what happened is that as a testing, initially Apocalypse instructed Cersei and Eobard to kill Exodus, which they refused to do. He then instructed Exodus to kill them, which he refused to do. And in fact, he turned on Apocalypse and actually ended up fighting Apocalypse and trying to overpower him, right? Because again, Exodus, being a guy who very much follows religious convictions, comes to the realization that Apocalypse is, by all standards of measurement, a false god. And in fact, he declares him that Apocalypse is not the god that he purports himself to be. He's just a really powerful guy. And so when Exodus turns on Apocalypse, Apocalypse overpowers him and then locks him away. Now, the biggest issue that you had to contend with when it came to that is in later stories, Exodus just demonstrated levels of power that were so high that it left people asking, how in the hell could Apocalypse beat this guy? And so what Marvel did is they added in the caveat that his powers are tied to his confidence. If he's surrounded by the right kind of people, or if he has full confidence in himself, that Exodus's powers reach their total peak. And this guy is an absolute monster when he's operating at his peak. But even when he just believes in himself, his power is more than enough to rival Apocalypse and really even overcome Apocalypse. And that's how Marvel fixed that, is by saying that at the time when he initially fought Apocalypse, he wasn't entirely certain of what he was capable of. There was a little fear when it came to Apocalypse, and he didn't have the highest amount of confidence in himself. And that's how Insaba Nur was able to defeat him. And so following that, he was effectively locked away. Now, one of the things that this does is it jumps back to the modern era, right? Following this kind of flashback, it jumps back to the modern events when the Eternals launched the attack of the Unimind, right? Like literally uniting their minds together and launching a telepathic attack against Krakoa and the Quiet Council. And so as that happens, of course, the telepaths themselves are able to fend off the attack. But the funny thing here is that where Xavier and everybody else is basically struggling to hold their own, Bennett's doing it with the greatest of ease. He's able to just hold it off, right? And it's just kind of like, yep, I mean, it's a thing that I'm dealing with, because while he's dealing with the Unimind, he's flashing back on his own memories, which if anything, this is a testament to how powerful he is. But then following that, he kind of touches back on his own history and talks about how he had slept for hundreds of years and then was ultimately woken up by what he thought was another, not really a mutant god, but a kind of messiah. He was woken up by Magneto. Now again, this is in the old X-Force comics, X-Force number 25, and this is when Magneto arrives and purports himself as a messiah, because this was old school Magneto, or really kind of new old school Magneto. This is during the X-Men Volume 2 era. And that in effect what had happened is that when Magneto woke up Exodus, that Exodus ended up joining his acolytes. Now the acolytes of Magneto were amazing back in the day, Fabian Cortez and all those guys, but basically they were like people who were just religiously devoted to Magneto. They saw him as a god in a lot of ways, right? The messiah who was going to bring about the positive change that they had been looking for, which was to basically eliminate humanity in terms of its hatred of mutants, and to either lead mutants into a better place, which in this instance was basically Avalon, or it was to eradicate the mutant population in its entirety so the mutants could live on Earth without fear of humans hunting them. But the thing about this is that Bene Gesserit came to the realization quite quickly that basically Magneto was not really a messiah or anything like that. If anything, he was kind of a prophet, but much like Apocalypse, he was just a mutant who was out there who was purporting this idea that he can lead people into a better future. And so ultimately Exodus became disillusioned and ended up walking away. Now, of course, jumping back to the current events again, this leads to Wolverine showing up and saying, like, there's some kind of silent Eternal running around here and is killing off the various members of the Five. Now, we saw that during the Judgment Day story, if you guys recall, that you literally had that Eternal who was killing the members of the Five, and that Magneto was able to stop her before they could go on, like, eradicating everybody. Because once the Five are gone, there's no way to resurrect anybody anymore, right? Because the Five are the means by which people are resurrected. So there's no way to resurrect them. So that's why they're really kept in the hatchery. They're kept exceedingly well protected by the mutants. In fact, they're protected more than Xavier and Magneto are, right? They're like, the entirety of Krakoa lives and dies by the members of the Five. They almost caught Hope Summers and so on and so forth. And so it's a really, really cool thing, because what Exodus does is, in listening to all of this, like Emma Frost talking and all these guys, he's like, I need to interpret this situation in a way that I understand. And so he's like, I am a knight, right? And I am in the desert. And this force is not the Eternals that I'm facing off against. It's just a dragon, right? I'm interpreting it in a way that just makes the most sense to me. And so literally it's one of those things where he kind of mulls over this whole situation. And then he starts thinking about Hope Summers. And that's when he comes to this realization, or really just kind of gives us this realization that he had, that for the very first time in the history of his life, he encountered what he actually thought was a true Messiah, and the person he views as an actual Messiah. And it's the reason why Exodus has such a reverence towards Hope Summers on the island of Krakoa. You've probably noticed it as you've been reading the different X-Men comics. We haven't heavily focused on it because in all honesty, I didn't know if they were ever going to really explore it at all, but they are here, right? Kieron Gillen is focusing on it here. And the reason for this, and Exodus even says that, is he says, when the Scarlet Witch, he refers to her as the Red Witch, but he says, when the Scarlet Witch altered reality during House of M and then set everything back, and in doing so, took away 98% of the mutant population's powers, reduced the population down to about 198 mutants, that he was one of the only mutants that retained his abilities. Now, different fan bases have argued different things based on the power of Exodus, that Exodus was so incredibly powerful that he subconsciously used his own powers to actually override the influence of the Scarlet Witch so he could maintain his own abilities. Again, that's just total fan speculation. There's never been anything in the comics to indicate that was the case, although it'd be amazing if it were true. But regardless, he looks at this whole thing and says, like, for a time, there were so few of us left. I thought we were on the brink of destruction. I thought our extinction was imminent. But the truth is that in the main Marvel universe, following the events of House of M, decimation and all that kind of stuff, that's when you basically started coming into Hope Summers. When Hope Summers popped up on the scene, you eventually got the 12 Lights storyline. And the 12 Lights storyline was basically Hope Summers becoming the Messiah, and the fact that her birth solidified the return of the mutant population to the main Marvel universe. Mutants started being born at a higher rate, right? They were literally coming back. And so that's why Exodus sees Hope Summers as a true mutant Messiah, and he takes it as a personal mission in saying, because the Eternals had launched an attack against Hope, and because they almost killed Hope, that now they have basically attacked what he views as being his God, right? His Messiah, the Messiah of the mutant population. And so in response, it's one of these amazing things, because while they are able to overcome the Unimind, this leads to the secondary attack of the Eternals, which we talked about at the end of Judgment Day, when you basically have these just enormous Eternals who aren't really machines. They are actually eternal beings that basically start attacking Krakoa. And these things are massive and powerful. We don't know exactly how powerful, but we know they're exceedingly powerful. And it's one of these amazing moments where like Exodus just has this insane monologue. He tells Hope Summers, right? When Hope Summers says, we're not ready for this, right? We're not ready for those guys. That's a level of power that we as mutants are not ready for. The response of Exodus is, we are, and I am, right? He says, return to safety and return the fallen warriors to the field. Be an inspiration. Guard the flame of mutant life. Be yourself. It is more than sufficient. And when she says, what are you going to do? His response is, they're dragons, Hope. What do you think I'm going to do? And he says, I am the Pope of a new church, like Peter was long ago. He says, Peter was the rock upon which the Nazarene mutant built his church. And he says, yes, I am that rock, but I am also the rock in the hand of Cain. I can build or I can destroy, and no one out there can do it on the level that I can. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. I gotta say, man, this story arc just keeps getting better and better. God, it's absolutely phenomenal. But we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.